Why her? Of all the people in the world, of all the faces in every crowded lecture hall, every rain-soaked training pitch, every echo-filled corridor of West Bridgecross College, why did it have to be her? Ara Finch pressed her back against the cold concrete wall of the tunnel beneath the stadium stands, her chest heaving, her mind completely blank for the first time in her life. She could still feel it. That impossible, accidental, devastating half-second of contact, like a match struck against her mouth. I hate her, she told herself. I have always hated her. Then why were her hands shaking? Chapter 1. 2 girls, 2 worlds, 1 campus. At West Bridgecross College, most people knew Ara Finch the way you know the furniture in a room you've stopped seeing. Present, reliable, unremarkable. She sat in the 3rd row of every lecture hall without exception, hair always gathered back in a practical knot, oversized hoodie sleeves pulled down over her knuckles even in September. She wrote her notes at a speed that made her neighbors glance over and then quietly feel inadequate. STEM scholarship. Perfect attendance, the kind of student professors cited anonymously as an example to the rest of the class. She was never late. She was never loud. She was never quite included. Ara had understood early, sometime in the first week of her first semester, that college bullies were a different species from the ones in films. They didn't shove you into lockers. They didn't leave visible marks. They smiled at the right moments, laughed a half beat too loud, and arranged things so that you always felt the tiniest fraction smaller than everyone else in the room. Invisible and too visible at the same time. An inconvenience in human form. And at the center of all of it, reliably, was Vera Blackwood. Vera was everything Ara had decided she didn't want to be and couldn't entirely stop noticing. She moved through campus the way weather moves, with total indifference to the things she affected. Designer boots, perfect eyeliner that somehow survived entire days without smudging, a laugh that carried across courtyards and made heads turn. She had the particular confidence of someone who had never once walked into a room and wondered if she belonged there. Friends trailing in her wake like a comet's tail, reputation preceding her like a herald. And for reasons Ara had never satisfactorily explained to herself, she had become one of Vera's preferred targets. "Nice hoodie," Vera had drawled one Tuesday afternoon, appearing at the edge of Ara's desk like weather. One hip cocked, dark eyes sliding over her with the lazy assessment of someone who found what they were looking at mildly entertaining. "Do you own anything that isn't gray?" Ara hadn't looked up. She never did. Silence was the cheapest form of armor. Vera had smirked at the top of her head and drifted back to her orbit of admirers, satisfied with her small conquest, moving on to more interesting things. That was how it always went. That was college. But college was not the only arena. Under stadium floodlights, Ara Finch did not disappear. She arrived. Only the moment she stepped onto the football pitch in her black and gold kit, captain's armband tied precisely below her left elbow, something shifted in her posture. The shoulders that spent most of the day curved slightly inward, defensively, squared themselves. Her jaw set. Her eyes, which she kept carefully downcast through corridors and lecture halls, went sharp and still with the particular focus of someone who had found the one environment where nothing about her was soft. The pitch was hers. She had made it hers through 4 years of training that started before dawn and ended after dark, through tactical obsession, through the kind of quiet, relentless work that doesn't look like passion from the outside, but burns with it underneath. Across the center line, adjusting her own captain's armband with the easy confidence of someone who had never had to earn a room's respect because she had always simply occupied it, stood Vera Blackwood, captain of Southridge FC Star Striker, the sort of player that sports journalists described as electric and crowds described as magnetic and opposing defenders described, usually under their breath, as a nightmare. Vera spotted her across the pitch and laughed, an actual, unguarded laugh. Like Ara's presence was the punchline of a joke she'd been waiting for. "Well," she called across midfield, voice carrying easily on the evening air. "Didn't know library girls were let out past sunset." Ara stepped into position without acknowledging the smile. She kept her eyes cold and her voice flat. "Try to keep up." The whistle blew. What followed was less a football match and more a declaration. From the first contested ball, it was personal in a way neither of their teams fully understood, and both of their captains understood completely. Ara went in hard, clean by the rules, but unforgiving by intention, stripping the ball from Vera's foot with a precision that made it look effortless. She didn't look back as Vera stumbled. "Careful," she said mildly, already sprinting. "Wouldn't want you to break a nail." Vera was back on her feet in seconds, chasing her down, shoulder checking her into a skid across the turf with enough force to feel it tomorrow. "Thought you were supposed to be smart, Finch," she shot over her shoulder. Or does that only apply when there's a textbook involved?" The match turned brutal in the way that matches between two people who know each other's exact pressure points always do. Every tackle between them was deliberate. Every interception felt personal. Ara marked Vera with the obsessive precision of someone who had studied her, cutting off her angles before she reached them, forcing her to overextend, punishing her when she did. When Ara slipped past the defense and scored, she didn't celebrate. She just turned, walked back to position, and let her eyes find Vera's for exactly 1 second. Too slow. Vera answered by ripping a shot past the goalkeeper 10 minutes later, spinning back toward Ara with a razor-edged smile. "I guess all that studying didn't quite cover that one." By halftime, they were shouting at each other between gasps for breath, both of them sweat-soaked and furious, neither willing to concede a single inch of ground. The final whistle called a draw. It felt like a loss for both of them. As they passed each other leaving the pitch, Vera leaned in, close enough that Ara caught the scent of her, grass and exertion, and underneath it something warmer, something that had no business being noticeable, and said, voice low and cutting, "Enjoy your little fantasy out here. Tomorrow you're still just the quiet girl everyone walks straight over." Ara stopped. She turned. She met Vera's eyes without flinching, which was, she had learned, the most effective thing she could do to someone who expected her to look away. "You enjoy your popularity," she said. "Out here, you're nothing special." They walked in opposite directions. The anger crackled in the cold air between them like static before a storm. No respect, no admiration, just rivalry sharp enough to draw blood, and something beneath it that neither of them was looking at yet. Chapter 2. The Assignment. Nobody asked for it. Started with scattered papers on a lecture hall floor. Ara was halfway to the front of the room, arms full of folders, when something solid and deliberate connected with her shoulder, hard enough to knock the breath from her, hard enough to send every paper she was carrying spinning across the floor in a slow cascade of chaos. A familiar laugh followed before she'd even finished stumbling. "Watch it," Vera said, not slowing, not looking back. "Some of us have somewhere to be." Ara crouched, cheeks burning, jaw locked against everything she wanted to say. She gathered her work with hands that trembled slightly at the knuckles. Not from distress, she told herself, from controlled anger, which was different, and when she finally looked up, Vera was already in her seat 3 rows back. Legs stretched out, one boot crossed over the other, smirk settled into place like it lived there permanently. Their eyes met across the room. The mutual disdain was so complete, it was almost elegant. "Careful," Vera said pleasantly, as Ara passed her row. Wouldn't want a repeat performance with the notes. Ara said nothing. Her fingers curled tighter around the edges of her folders. Professor Hale arrived moments later. On clapping once for attention with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been managing roomfuls of undergraduates long enough to have lost all patience for preamble. "Midterm projects," she announced. "Pairs. I'll be assigning them." The collective groan was immediate and reflexive. Professor Hale ignored it with practiced serenity and began reading names. "Ara Finch." She paused. "Vera Blackwood." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something is about to become a scene. Ara froze. She felt it. The stillness that comes before a decision. And then, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she stood up. The gasps were genuine. Apparently she had been background furniture for long enough that the act of rising to her feet constituted a disruption. "Professor," Ara said, and her voice came out steadier than she'd expected, considering the knot that had formed somewhere between her sternum and her throat. "I'd like to request a different partner." Every eye in the room had found her. She kept her gaze on the professor. "I need someone who takes this course seriously," she continued, before the silence could solidify against her. "Someone who won't hold me back." From 3 rows back, an incredulous laugh. "Oh, please," Vera said, the words falling out sharp with disbelief. "You think I want to work with her either? Pair me with anyone else." Literally anyone. Professor Hale raised an eyebrow, looking between them with the expression of someone who had seen a great many things and was mildly entertained by this particular one. Interesting, she said, both students in agreement. A brief, almost imperceptible pause. No. Hope, which had been small and cautious, extinguished itself. You'll work together, the professor said pleasantly. Learning to collaborate with people you find difficult is, in fact, part of what I'm assessing. Vera slouched back in her chair and said something under her breath that the acoustics of the lecture hall mercifully didn't carry. Ara sat back down. She didn't look at Vera again. She made her handwriting very precise for the rest of the lecture and focused on the words in front of her, and not the way her heart was still thudding from the effort of standing up. The lecture hall emptied in that particular rush of people escaping before they can be asked anything else. Ara waited. She watched Vera gather her things at the unhurried pace of someone who moved through the world on her own timetable, and when Vera was halfway through the door, Ara spoke. Blackwood. Vera stopped, turned slowly with the languid deliberateness of someone deciding whether to acknowledge something. Finch, she said, finally working out how to use your words. Ara crossed the distance between them until she was close enough that Vera actually had to look at her properly. Not around her, not past her, but at her. And whatever Vera saw, something shifted slightly in her expression. Just slightly. Library, Ara said. After class today, you'll be there. No inflection, no softening, no question mark. You're doing your part. I'm not carrying this project alone. Vera blinked once. Then something complicated moved across her face before she replaced it with amusement. Wow, she said. I had no idea you had it in you. Be there, Ara said, or fail. Either way, it won't be my problem. She turned and walked out before Vera could speak again. Vera stood in the doorway of the emptied lecture hall and watched her go, and felt something she had no immediate category for. Irritation, definitely, threaded through with something less comfortable. Because for just a moment, that hadn't been the quiet girl she'd been dismissing all year. That had been someone else entirely, and Vera wasn't sure she knew what to do with that. Chapter 3. Under the library lights. The library was the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel amplified. The soft friction of a turning page, the distant click of a keyboard, like the barely there hum of fluorescent lighting. Ara was already there when Vera arrived. Of course she was. Books stacked with infuriating neatness. Laptop open to a document already half-populated with organized notes. A printed outline sitting at the edge of the table like a small declaration of intent. Vera dropped into the chair across from her without ceremony. You're here early? You're late, Ara said without looking up. By 5 minutes. Vera leaned back in the chair and crossed her arms. Try not to have a crisis about it. Ara's fingers paused on the keyboard. Slowly, with the particular deliberateness of someone making a choice, she lifted her gaze. And the look she gave Vera was the same one she used on the pitch. Assessing, cold, and entirely without the softness that most people expected from someone with her face. Sit properly, Ara said, or leave. I don't have the patience for posturing. Vera tilted her head. Funny, you've got plenty of energy for it on the field. That's different. Ara slid the printed outline across the table. Case analysis section is yours. I've broken down what's required. The methodology is already outlined. Vera glanced at it. Bold of you to assign me work before we've even agreed on anything, Captain. Don't call me that. The corner of Vera's mouth curved upward, slow and deliberate. Why not? You've earned it every time you've shut me down at midfield. Ara leaned forward slightly, just enough to narrow the space between them, just enough to make something change in the quality of the air. If you put half the effort into your coursework that you put into getting under my skin, she said quietly and precisely, you wouldn't be pulling a C average in a class you're capable of passing in your sleep. That landed. Vera straightened. Her eyes went sharp, and something flickered in them. Not quite anger. Something more complicated than anger. You think I don't try? I think you try when something matters to you, Ara said, and her voice stayed level and honest rather than cruel. You're disciplined. You're focused. You're aggressive when you need to be. You've just decided that caring about academics is something you're too cool for, so You don't. The silence that followed had a different texture than the silences before it. Under the table, without either of them choosing it, their knees brushed. The contact was light, barely anything, the incidental geometry of two people at a small table, and neither of them moved away. "Shook, you're always this condescending," Vera said, but her voice had changed slightly. Quieter, less performance in it. "I'm not being condescending," Ara said. "I'm being accurate. There's a difference." Vera leaned in, closing some of the space across the table, close enough that Ara could feel the warmth radiating from her, catch the faint trace of whatever she wore that smelled like cedar and something sharper underneath it. "You're telling me I'm capable," Vera said. "That's almost a compliment, Finch. Should I be flattered?" "You should be motivated," Ara said. "Those are different things." "Are they?" They were too close. Both of them were aware of it at the same moment, the awareness arriving in the air between them like a change in pressure before rain. Aunt Aura could see the exact line where Vera's eyeliner met the outer corner of her eye, could see the way her throat moved slightly when she swallowed. Vera's gaze dropped, briefly, barely perceptibly, to Ara's mouth, then back up. And when their eyes met again, something in the quality of the silence had shifted into something Ara didn't have a word for and wasn't going to look for one right now. She pushed her chair back. "Do the work," she said, standing, gathering her composure along with her notes. "Be here next session. Don't make me regret this." She was already turning away when Vera spoke. "You know," Vera said, light and deliberate, "for someone who claims to dislike me, you pay a remarkable amount of attention." Ara paused. She didn't turn around. "Don't mistake observation for interest," she said, and she walked away without looking back. Behind her, Vera leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, watching the space where Ara had been, and smiled in a way she would have denied completely if anyone had seen it. Because Finch hadn't said no. She'd said, "Don't mistake it," which wasn't the same thing at all. And Vera Blackwood had always been very good at reading what people meant beneath the words they chose. Chapter 4. The problem with noticing. Vera Blackwood had a problem, and the problem was that she couldn't stop noticing things. She noticed that she had read the same paragraph of her case analysis 4 times and still couldn't have told anyone what it said. She noticed that she arrived to her 9 a.m. class 3 minutes early on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the days it shared a building with Ara's, and had no reasonable explanation for that. She noticed that when Ara walked in late to one session, her eyes had gone to the door before her brain had registered the decision to look. She noticed the way Ara tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the small, unconscious gesture of someone so absorbed in a problem that the rest of the world had gone momentarily silent around her. She noticed that Ara's handwriting was smaller in the margins of her notes than in the body of them, like her thoughts ran faster than her main ideas and had to squeeze in wherever they fit. "Stop it," Vera told herself, once slamming her notebook shut with enough force to make the girl across the study room table look up in alarm. This was rivalry. This was ego. This was the particular irritation of being challenged by someone she had underestimated and finding that she couldn't quite put them back in the box she'd built for them. That was all this was. It was definitely not the way her chest did something inconvenient whenever she remembered the feeling of Ara's knee against hers under that library table, warm and still, neither of them moving away. Definitely not. Chapter 5. Collision Course. The next match came on a wet Wednesday evening, the pitch gleaming under floodlights, the air cold enough to see breath. Northside versus Southridge had always been fierce. Tonight, from the first whistle, but it was something else. Something with an edge that made both benches watch with slightly widened eyes. "Going to hide behind your midfield again?" Vera called as she closed in on Ara near the center line, her voice low enough that only Ara could hear it. "Or are you brave enough to actually lose this time?" "Focus on your footing," Ara returned, stealing the ball with a touch so clean it was almost insulting. "You're sloppy when you let your emotions run." Vera snarled and chased her down, forcing her toward the sideline. They moved like they'd been designed to occupy the same space and fight over it, anticipating each other, countering before the decision was fully made, reading each other's bodies with the fluency of months of opposed attention. "You think you're better than me?" Vera pushed, closing in. "Oh, I think I'm more disciplined," Ara said, and she said it without heat, which was somehow more infuriating. There's a difference. They collided near midfield. It wasn't a foul, not quite, but it was hard and close and tangled, both of them fighting for possession with hands and shoulders, and the kind of full-body contest that referees watch carefully and players ignore completely. For a moment they were pressed together, movement arrested, neither gaining ground. Vera's breath caught. She could smell her. Soap and exertion and cold air and something underneath all of it that was distinctly, specifically Ara, warm and sharp and frustratingly present. She felt Ara's breath against her cheek, soft and uneven. The world narrowed to the space between them. "Get off," Vera snapped, but she didn't move. "Oh, you're the one pushing," Ara hissed back, and she didn't move either. They shoved at the exact same moment, lost their footing on the wet grass at the exact same moment, and went down together. The ball rolled away forgotten as they hit the turf, Vera landing half over Ara, hands braced on either side of her shoulders. For a suspended, impossible half-second, neither of them moved. Their faces were very close, the stadium lights blurred soft above them. And in that breath-held silence, some physics of proximity that neither of them had planned or chosen closed the last distance between them. Their lips met. It wasn't soft. It wasn't gentle. It was heat and shock and adrenaline and the disorienting collision of everything they'd been building toward for months, all of it landing in one fractured instant that neither of them had seen coming. They froze, eyes wide, minds blank. Then they ripped apart like something burned. Vera started, pushing up onto her knees. Ara was already scrambling to her feet, face flushed, something wild and unreadable in her expression. "I can't," she said, barely audible, more to herself than to Vera. And then she turned and ran. The referee's whistle blew, shouts from both benches, substitutes gestured onto the field. Ara disappeared down the tunnel at a sprint, and Vera, without making any conscious decision about it, followed. Chapter 6. The tunnel. She found her in the concrete corridor beneath the stands. De'Ara had her hands flat against the wall, head dropped forward, breathing hard, her dark hair falling loose from its tie in pieces. She looked like someone who had run into a wall, which was, in a sense, exactly what had happened. "Running?" Vera said, stepping into the low tunnel light. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "That's new." Ara spun around fast enough to nearly lose her footing on the smooth floor. "You shouldn't have followed me." The tunnel hummed around them. The distant muffled sound of the match continuing above, the far-off clang of lockers, the low buzz of overhead fluorescents. Private. Too private. The concrete walls brought everything close. Vera stopped a few steps away. Her chest was still rising and falling hard from the sprint. "Then why did you run?" "I didn't run." The words were automatic, unconvincing. "You absolutely ran!" Vera took a step forward, not touching, just rearranging the air between them. "The second it happened, you looked at me like I'd done something terrible and you bolted." Silence crystallized between them. Ara swallowed. The memory arrived again without permission. The press of bodies, the loss of balance, the half-second of warm contact that had landed somewhere vital and hadn't left. Adrenaline. Proximity. An accident. Obviously. "That didn't mean anything," she said, and she said it too fast. Vera's eyes dropped. Not to her mouth, but close enough to feel deliberate, close enough that Ara's breath caught. "Then why are your hands shaking?" Ara looked down. She hadn't noticed. She curled her fingers into fists and brought them to her sides. "Wait, they're not." "They are." Vera's voice had changed. Lower, the performative edge gone, something rougher and more honest underneath. "And you ran like it scared you half to death." "It didn't scare me." "Then what did it do?" The question landed in the space between them and stayed there. Heavy, patient, not going anywhere. Vera stepped forward. One stride, two. And then her hand was fisted in Ara's hoodie, not gentle, pulling her back against the wall with the controlled urgency of someone who has run out of the patience to pretend. "You don't get to act like that was nothing," she said, her voice rough at the edges. "And then bolt like I imagined it." Ara shoved back, her hands pressing flat against Vera's chest, feeling the rapid thunder of her heartbeat beneath her palms. "Well, you think you're the only one who's confused right now?" Vera's fingers flexed in the fabric. "Confused," she said, and the word sounded wrong in her own mouth. "That's not—" She stopped. "What?" Ara's voice had gone tight. What is it then? Neither of them answered. The tunnel felt smaller than it had been a minute ago. The air between them had thickened with something that had no name, or maybe had too many names, and they were both refusing to use any of them. I hate you, Vera said. Good, Ara shot back, because I don't know what I'd do if I didn't. The words settled like sparks on dry timber. Neither of them moved. Vera's hand was still twisted in Ara's jersey. Ara's fingers were still pressed to Vera's chest. Their breaths came unevenly, slightly out of sync, almost matching. The air between them had been volatile for months, since the first match, since the first drawled comment and the first cold silence in response, since knees that hadn't moved away from each other under a library table, and a look across the space that both of them had looked away from too quickly. Vera's eyes dropped to Ara's mouth. Not briefly this time, not quickly. A challenge. A warning. A question. Ara didn't look away. Then leave, she said. But her hands hadn't moved. Her back was against the wall, and she hadn't moved, and she wasn't going to, and they both knew it. Vera kissed her. It was not soft. It was not tentative. It was everything they'd been building for months. The fury and the friction and the relentless attention they'd paid to each other while pretending it was something simpler. All of it crashing together at once. Inera gasped into it and grabbed Vera's jersey and pulled her closer, kissing her back with the same unguarded ferocity, giving back everything that had been thrown at her. It was nothing like the accident on the pitch. That had been shock. This was choice. They broke apart breathless, foreheads nearly touching in the low light, both of them breathing hard. Neither spoke, neither looked away, and in the hollow space the words had left behind, where hate and rival and nothing had lived, something else was taking root. Wordless still, neither of them ready to name it, but undeniably, irreversibly there. The tunnel hummed, the lights buzzed, the distant sound of the crowd filtered through the concrete from somewhere above them. Vera's hand loosened slowly in Ara's jersey, but didn't let go entirely. Ara's fingers uncurled from Vera's, wore but stayed where they were. This is a problem, Ara said quietly. Yeah, Vera agreed. Neither of them said what kind of problem. Neither of them stepped back. For the first time since they'd been standing across from each other on a football pitch, hurling sharp words like weapons, the silence between them felt like something other than a battlefield. It felt cautiously and terrifyingly like the beginning of something else entirely. To be continued? If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. This is only the beginning of Ara and Vera's story, and if you think the tension was impossible to ignore now, just wait. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, where things get considerably more complicated for both of them. Hit like if you felt every second of that tunnel scene, and drop a comment below. I want to know, did you see it coming, or did it catch you completely off guard? Your support means everything. See you in the next one.